I'm speaking today about Pan-Africanism in the Pacific, race and West Papuan non-state diplomacy. We don't usually think of the island of New Guinea as part of Africa, but nationalists from the island painted it that way in the 1960s, trying to use race as a diplomatic asset. So my presentation is about the intersection of race and racism with the diplomacy of independence movements. And this project started with an accident of research. I was working on a conventional piece of diplomatic history on the Kennedy administration in the United States and its conflict resolution efforts in Southeast Asia, specifically the attempt to resolve a conflict over control of the western half of the island of New Guinea. A dispute that pitted the Netherlands, the colonial ruler of this territory, against Indonesia, the former colony that claimed inheritance rights to this last piece of the old Dutch East Indies. The indigenous peoples of the territory themselves, generally called Papuans after another name for the island, were strangely absent from this historical narrative. In looking for their voices in between the volume of official diplomatic correspondence, I came across a letter from a group of nationalist leaders to the Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia. In a dispute where the key players were Dutch, Indonesian, American, and perhaps Australian, why write to Haile Selassie? Well, the letter answered that. Using the preferred indigenous name for the territory, West Papua, the letter read, "We, the people of West Papua, urgently beseech your majesty not to abandon us to Indonesian imperialism. We are definitely a people of our own, physically, racially, geographically, and religiously, completely different from the Indonesian Asians. We belong to the Brotherhood of Melanesian people, and as such, to the Negroid race." Apologies for the word Negroid, it's the word used in the primary sources at the time. So, in other words, the Papuans were claiming to be Africans, living far off in the Pacific. And this document wasn't an isolated instance. The same claim was made frequently by Papuan nationalists. It appears repeatedly in the documents. So what I'm interested in here is the intersection of diplomatic history with identity, specifically identities of race and indigeneity, in which Papuans were forced by international politics to make a choice between presenting themselves as a so-called tribal people or as Africans in all but name, who just happened to be thousands of miles away in the Pacific. They chose the Pan-African identity based on a tactical consideration of which identity would play better globally. At a time of African decolonization, that meant the Papuans tried to present themselves as Pan-African, and that shaped Papuan self-perceptions ever since. It still gets used today. So first I'll start with the conventional diplomatic history. Indonesia declared its independence from Dutch rule in 1945, and after 4 years of fighting and diplomacy, its independence was internationally recognized at the end of 1949. But not entirely. To save their honor and their position as a world power, the Netherlands held on to West Papua. Indonesian nationalists continued to see their country as the rightful ruler of all the former Dutch East Indies, so long as any part of what Thai historian Tongchai Winichakul called the geo-body of the nation lay outside of Indonesian rule, decolonization was not complete. In this map from Indonesian middle schools of the 1950s, for instance, West Papua is clearly included as a territory of Indonesia, but a line down the center of the island of New Guinea leaves nothing to the east. Indonesia is a single national territory in this imagined geography. Territory mattered, and the lingering Dutch presence on part of Indonesia's claimed territory was painted as an amputation of our national body by Indonesian leaders. President Sukarno, for instance, declared, "Compared to our archipelago, West Papua is the size of a horseradish leaf, yet it is part of our body." Would anybody allow one of his limbs to be amputated without putting up a fight? Does not a man cry out in pain if even the tiniest finger of his hand is cut off? And so the struggle to return West Papua to the fold of the motherland, as it was called, became the dominant issue, one of the dominant issues in Indonesian politics through the 1950s and early 60s, as the government moved out of the American orbit and towards a more assertive third world nationalism. Now, the Netherlands held on to West Papua, again, as I've said, partly to save its national honor at a time of decolonization. The post-war international climate made it necessary for the Netherlands to justify its continued colonial presence in Papua. So Dutch authorities insisted that there were two different races in the Netherlands East Indies. Papuans were defined as Melanesian, an anthropological category that covers the mostly dark-skinned, curly-haired peoples of the southwestern Pacific, and thus they were not Indonesian, another anthropological term describing straight-haired, lighter-skinned Southeast Asian islanders. By making race the reason for their presence in Papua, the justification for their continued rule in Papua, they set the boundaries within which a new Papuan identity could emerge. The Dutch themselves, they argued, were there as selfless guardians. With Indonesia threatening to cause trouble in Southeast Asia at a time of Cold War, and perhaps even invade West Papua and enter a war with the Netherlands, the Kennedy administration in Washington was concerned. It quickly intervened to mediate peace talks and essentially, after some back and forth, forced the Dutch to be present at those talks and to agree there to a staged transfer of power, of control, to Indonesia. To save Dutch face, the deal saw the Netherlands agree to transfer West Papua to a direct United Nations administration, which the following year would transfer West Papua to Indonesian rule. The UN and the US government worked hand in hand on this deal. No West Papuan voices were present. My interest here is how ideas of racial identity were formed during the diplomatic contest and how they in turn affected the diplomacy. So much of this was outward directed. Two images contended, as I've said. In one, Papuans appeared as tribal peoples, literally dressed in feathers, modern day Stone Age parallels to North American Indians, and worse still, headhunters, coupertes de têtes, in the title of this book published in France at the time. In the other, the Papuans appear as industrious people trying to develop, just like newly independent countries in Africa. Now, clearly, international politics made the second image more favorable in an independence campaign. So I'm going to rewind back to 1944 in West Papua. So that year, General Douglas MacArthur's US troops island hopped their way into West Papua, pushing back the Japanese. The arrival of US troops, and especially of African American soldiers, made a major impression. We saw Black people being equal to white people, many Papuan accounts of the time go. For that was the appearance they saw, even if it was not, of course, the reality for African American soldiers. Then, in the 1940s and 50s, Dutch anthropologists played a major role in governing Papua and in developing the idea of Melanesian-Indonesian difference. Papuan nationalists seized on this idea of difference to assert their identity as a people, with their own right to independence. In adopting race as a marker of difference, Papuan nationalists embraced a new mental map of sharp division, rather than gradual shading, between Indonesia and Melanesia. Yet Melanesia alone, the idea of a Melanesian federation alone, was not enough to meet the needs for international diplomatic support. And so the nationalist mental map, the nationalist Papuan mental map based on a Melanesian racial identity, expanded to include Africa. And this Voice of the Negroids of the Pacific to the Negroids Throughout the World pamphlet, published by Papuan nationalists in 1962, is a prime example. So I'm going to quote from it again. Brothers and sisters Negroids, it's about time you break away from your busy work to listen to what we Papuans have to say. Many, many times you have heard about us from the Dutch and the Indonesians without having known us. Now we will take the floor ourselves. We are living in the Pacific. Our people are called Papuans. Our ethnic origin is the Negroid race. The pamphlet made an audacious claim that mobilized ideas of race to back a demand for independence, in other words. As Papuan diplomats traveled through Africa, their hosts remarked with surprise on their appearance. These inhabitants of a Dutch colony claimed by Indonesia, quote, looked African. Armed with that perception, they tried to turn race into a diplomatic asset, transforming marginalization and powerlessness into a tool that they could wield internationally, into a form of power. The case for the Papuans then is not just one of diplomacy, it was an effort to convince the world that there was such a thing as the Papuan people, that they existed. So the Voice of the Negroids opening article written by the nationalist leader Nicholas Yohe insisted, we Papuans know that we are an independent people. And this is the time we want to fight before the international forum to remain ourselves. We do not want to be slaves anymore. Lest there be any mistaking its intent, the pamphlet was copiously illustrated with photographs of Papuans. One shown here depicted a Papuan teacher alongside Frédéric Guilherme, Upper Volta's ambassador to the United Nations. What is the ethnic difference between them? The caption asked. Its answer silently implied there was no difference. So with few prospects of Western support as the United States began to intervene, Papuan appeals to Africa seemed to be the only hope of generating new international support for self-determination for the Papuan people. So the territory hosted a visit by the heads of the Upper Volta and Dahomey UN delegations in April 1962. These countries today are Burkina Faso and Benin. Dahomey's delegate, Maxime Leopold Zollner, returned to New York profoundly struck, he said, by the racial differences between the inhabitants of New Guinea and those of Indonesia. Ambassador Girma of Upper Volta was also, quote, deeply impressed by the ethnic differences between Papuans and the inhabitants of Indonesia, which led him to disregard Jakarta's contention that West Papuans are Indonesians. Papuan nationalists toured Africa in the first half of 1962. Visits and appeals included the Brazzaville group of mostly former French colonies, with trips to Upper Volta, Burkina Faso, Senegal, Côte d'Ivoire, and Dahomey, or Benin now. But they aimed especially at key states seen as having a strong third world nationalist credentials or long-standing independence: Ethiopia, Liberia, Nigeria, Ghana, the Congo, Guinea, Sierra Leone. The problem with this effort to use race as a diplomatic asset was that it also left Papuans victim to ideas of space and place implicit in Western mind. In other words, to the racism inherent in Western minds in this time, at least. If they were Black, that made them to many in the West primitive, too primitive, in fact, to merit independence. So Stone Age images began to reach a wider American audience, beginning with the 1961 Harvard Peabody anthropological expedition to the Dani people of the interior mountains, and the many photographs of scantily clad Dani men and topless Dani women that were transmitted home. Also prominent in Western depictions were the Asmat people. Profiled in the 1960 film Le Ciel et la Boue, released in English in 1961 as The Sky Above, the Earth Below. Michael Rockefeller, a promising young anthropologist whose family name always conjured attention, added a fascination with Asmat art, shipping large amounts of it home to New York, where it can still be seen in museums. So here's the dominant international image, in this case of the Dani people with their picturesque spears and koteka or penis gourds, hopelessly backwards, warlike peoples, allegedly. An image that endures today in the writings of people like Jared Diamond, by the way. But there's another US image that I should also underline. In this next illustration, just to the left, the well-known Pan-African leader W.E.B. Du Bois, in a study of the state of Georgia, presents the Pan-African world. West Papua appears on the map, shaded as part of the Pan-African world. And this suggests an earlier imagined geography in which Papuans too were Black. It marks a far cry from the literally cartoonish images expressed in 1940s US pulp comic books. So, African support lingered, and this memory continued to sustain a Papuan sense of identity as a people with African kinship even after the Indonesian takeover. So this image shows continued support from Senegal, for instance, in West Africa. Claims of racial difference have been central to continued Papuan independence campaigning, and this support network continues to linger, seen, for instance, in lobbying for Papuan human rights by the US Congressional Black Caucus. The two-way evidence is evident in this year's Papuan Lives Matter campaign against racist Indonesian police and military violence, which started after many Papuan students were called monyet, or monkeys, as well as being the victims, of course, of physical violence and repression. What's really noticeable to me is that the claim to independence based on being cousins to Africa, entitled to join the wave of third world decolonization of the 1960s, has given way since the 1980s to what might be called a fourth world identity. Papuan claims are increasingly framed in the language of global indigenous rights. Within Indonesia, there are new links, such as with the Aliansi Masyarakat Adat Nusantara, or AMAN, the Alliance of Traditional or Indigenous Peoples of the Archipelago, or links with the Global Unrepresented Peoples and Nations Organization, UNPO, an alternative UN for independence movements. Here again is an effort to use identity as a diplomatic asset, showing the continued creative ability to reframe identity in dynamic ways by the Papuan nationalist movement. Now, I should add, for anyone who's curious for more, that the documents used here are all online at the website historybeyondborders.ca, and I encourage you to go ahead and take a look if you'd like. In any case, thank you. Merci. Terima kasih. Oleoni. Thanks for listening.